Good afternoon to all you good people. I'm really sorry that I couldn't join this meeting in person. I considered it such a privilege to be invited to participate in this year's summer school. And I had really been looking forward to coming to South Africa after so many years away because of the COVID pandemic. However, a combination of visa issues and my relocation made this impossible. So I hope that I can join future summer schools. I think this effort, this summer school on feminist economics is really important in its convening power, that it's able to bring together such a rich array of African feminist development actors to engage critically using a feminist economics lens and also looking at a whole range of issues, both long-standing and contemporary questions of our time. I really believe that with that kind of critical lens and insights about a whole range of issues, including conceptions of development, conceptions about what's an economy and how it's related to society, conceptions about the drivers of systematic and structural inequalities, and the implications of policies and their outcomes for households and their members and for social groups, can play a really indispensable role in the work to understand the nature of the current conjuncture of crisis that we find ourselves in. And most importantly, it can also help us think about the search for durable solutions. So because I have just 2 hours, my objectives for this session are rather modest. One, I just want to refresh our memories on 2 aspects of development discourses and policies in Africa. The first one being the histories and trajectories of development ideas and policies, and the second one being the contribution of feminist scholars and practitioners to these ideas. And 2, to start a conversation about the current state of gender and development policies and practices and the current development challenges of our times. So here's the outline of what I want to do. I first want us to discuss 2 of the most influential ideas about development in Africa, the modernization and dependency approaches. As you know, there are many, many schools of development. There are even post-development schools. But I chose these ones because of their influence on thinking about development in Africa. I next want to talk about some of the issues arising from the politics and practice of development. Thirdly, I want to hone in on ideas about gender and development and how they've developed in Africa, their politics and the practices they've engendered, such as gender mainstreaming and so on. And I last want to flag a number of issues, not to discuss them, but to flag them for our thinking about how to go forward. So development has had a very checkered history as both a set of ideas and an agenda for action. It's had some very high points, and its highest point probably would be in the immediate post-colonial era, and its lowest point would be in the era of economic liberalization and economic growth, particularly in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. It's been heavily influenced by 2 seemingly opposing views about development: the modernization approach, which emanated from Western scholars, and then the dependency theories, which emanated from the global South. Of course, thinkers like Andre Gunda Frank are not from the global South, and at the same time, his work was very heavily influenced by the time he spent in Brazil and in the global South. And here I want to focus actually on the ideas of Samir Amin, Africa's leading Marxist dependency thinker. I think if we look at these theories, these two theories of development and their variants, they can be identified by the following criteria. For me, this is a shorthand for simplifying one's thinking about these ideas. One is the main reasons they give for underdevelopment. Two, their attitudes to working people. Three, the kinds of priorities they put forward, whether it's modernizing economies, whether it's infrastructure, whether they address the social question, or whether it's about enlarging freedoms. For the role they give to the state, and last but not least, because for our purposes, this is important, the attitude to what is called in the Marxist literature, the woman quest. So in terms of modernization theories have been through many changes, but they are particularly well represented by Rostow's stages of economic growth, in which he basically divided societies into different stages according to their characteristics. So he first takes a linear approach to development, and is linked with the expansion of market relations. So he first identifies traditional society, which has limited technology and is static, and clearly that is Rostow's underdeveloped society. And then it moves into a different stage, which is what they call the preconditions for takeoff. And that movement is supposed to have been triggered by external influences and interests or markets. And this is the time when you begin to see commercial exploitation of agriculture and extractive industries. And then through that, there's an installation of physical infrastructure, roads, railways, and so on. And then there's a development of a manufacturing sector, and that's the takeoff stage. And then there's investment in manufacturing, which exceeds a certain percentage of national income, the development of modern social, economic, and political institutions. And then that stage is a drive to maturity. You have a wider industrial and commercial base, and then to the last stage where that economy can exploit its comparative advantage in international trade, and there's also high mass consumption. From what Rostow has described as the determinants of economic development, we can see that for modernization theories, the main reasons for underdevelopment are the fact that society is traditional, it's static, it has limited technology, and its market forces are not highly developed. A lot of things are being done outside markets. The attitude to working people in this kind of theory is that they are backward, not very well educated, and also not particularly productive. And the priorities for modernization are the modernization of economies, the development of physical infrastructure, and later social infrastructure, development of markets, industrialization. And here the state is seen as playing a very active role in development. It's actually powering the developmental process, although clearly modernization theories think that the role of outside influences and so on is quite key, and also the role of markets. In terms of the attitudes to the woman question, we'll say that because modernization theories are productivist and they prioritize elite formation, and although they're interested in mass consumption, they see women as part of the problem of development, to either outside it or also to be developed along with the other forces. So basically, standing outside this and opposing modernization theories are the Marxist dependency theories. And as I said, there are a whole load of them. Gunda Frank, Wallerstein, Arrighi, and so on. But here I want to focus on the ideas of Sami Amin because he was particularly interested in the African predicament. The basic foundation of world systems theories, which this group of theories represents, is that they are anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist, and are built on Marxism and Marxist ideas. And they saw underdevelopment as the outcome of three factors. One, the unevenness of productivity between different spheres, sectoral unevenness between center and periphery. They were also concerned about the disarticulation and distortion of underdeveloped economies of the periphery, made up of non-integrated sectors, with less flow of internal exchanges in the bid to satisfy the external demands imposed on them by the economies of the center. So basically, these are economies which are not about their own business. They are locked into a system where they are busy satisfying the demands of external forces. And the third one being that center that they are satisfying dominates politically, socially, and economically. And therefore, for Amin, the solution to underdevelopment was in the process of delinking and also polycentricity. Delinking is one of these terms that has generated a lot of questions and sometimes mischievous questions. And here I want to point out that he was not talking about delinking from everything or withdrawal from the world economy. It was more that he argued that one should subject mutual relations between various nations and regions of the world to varying imperatives of their own internal development and not the reverse. So basically, we should all come to this business of development and global economic relations and so on from our own standpoint of our own priorities of internal development. And so delinking is actually a manifesto for change, a rejection of the idea that the expansion of capitalism and subsequently the current dominant neoliberal paradigm are inescapable and therefore leave no room for change and national autonomy and national development. So that's one, the idea of basically development which is powered by the priorities of developing countries and not by the demands put on them by their location in the world economic system. The second one is about the polycentricity, which is that even though we have one planet, there should be several competing systems, and it's an alternative to this exclusionary, polarizing development, which Sami Amin refers to as maldevelopment. So you see very clearly that for Amin, the main reasons for underdevelopment are colonialism, imperialism, the disarticulation of sectors of the economy, and unequal center-periphery relations. His attitude to the working people is that they're exploited and they need to be liberated through sovereign national projects of liberation. And the priorities are endogenous development, the rearticulation and synergies among different sectors of economies, industrialization. The role of the state is to be an instrument for this process of endogenous development and basically should be an instrument of the working classes. If we ask about the attitude to the woman question, it's very clear that women are seen as part of class oppression, but at the same time, with the influence of Marxism, gender inequalities were seen as a secondary contradiction that would be solved once the big question of class oppression had been dealt with. Now, I want to mention a third approach to development, which has also influenced thinking on the African continent. And people loosely refer to these set of ideas as critical modernist ideas. What is interesting about this set of ideas is that they shift away from economistic approaches and also approaches that focus on the larger economy and focus on people. So Amartya Sen, I suppose, is the most famous representative of this kind of approach. And he saw development as freedom, the improvement and upliftment of the quality of life of people. And also development as a process of expanding real freedoms that people enjoy. And basically, this was a self-conscious departure from narrow views of development that identify development with economic growth or growth of the national product or with the rise in personal incomes or with industrialization or technological advancement and so on. There's a politics behind these ideas of development, particularly in Africa. Development was an important imperative of the anti-colonial struggle, which heated up after the Second World War and basically after the Great Depression. And in that period, the depredations of colonialism, the impoverishment of and overexploitation of the colonies and the oppression of the people of the colonies, the hard labor, the forced labor, the violence, and all of that, were at the forefront of minds and had basically heated up struggles across Africa against colonialism. And so the agenda that was influenced by development ideas was the question of nation building, one, and also the defeat of what was called the Trinity of anger, ignorance, and disease. And what was interesting in this period was that key anti-colonial leaders also offered their own vision of development. And this brought a unity between theory and practice. And so the Kwame Nkrumahs, the Nyereres, and the Cabrals wrote about colonialism, neocolonialism, imperialism as a cause of underdevelopment. And they were influenced by a combination of modernization and Marxist and dependency theories of development and liberation. And you could see it in the kinds of things they wanted to do. So for example, they were very interested in industrialization. They were interested in infrastructure development. Many of the large dams were built in this period of Africa's history. In terms of their ideas about women, it's interesting that several of the anti-colonial leaders actually wrote about the liberation of women as a precondition for development. Cabral was the most eloquent about this, and I would ask all of you who are interested, a few days ago, we were celebrating an anniversary for Cabral. To be good to read what Cabral had to say about women. It's quite forward-looking and amazing for the times that they were in. I would say that for me, he was one of the most advanced in thinking about the liberation of women. But he never managed to practice those ideas because he was murdered before independence. So I was making the point that development ideas have a politics and they also have a practice. So if you look at the development, the practices of the early independence period, Kwame Nkrumah, Nyerere, and others were very interested in industrialization, and they adhered to command policies, heavily state-led and state-driven. Kwame Nkrumah invited Arthur Lewis, the celebrated St. Lucian economist, Nobel Prize winner, considered to be one of the parents of development economics, to help to develop Ghana. And basically many of the ideas of development economics were tested in that period in countries like Ghana. There was a strong interest in rural development, and Nyerere in particular was very interested. Later on, this saw fruition in his whole program of Ujamaa and villagization and so on. What was very interesting about this period was that development was not only seen as an economic matter, but there were very strong social policy agendas and instruments, and women were considered partially for redress through affirmative action and certain productivist policies. But there was no particular critique of the social reproduction burden that women had assumed in society, and therefore what to do about it. So when the global economic crisis of the 70s came, and many of these ideas were jettisoned. The United Nations Economic Commission for Africa was led by an economist known as Adedeji, who developed the Lagos Plan for Action. Again, it was heavily influenced by modernization ideas, and also to a lesser extent by dependency theories. It was very interested in industrialization and independence for African economies and so on. And unfortunately, these ideas were not taken up. Instead, Africa went into a period of economic liberalization and structural adjustment programs. I think most of you are au fait with what happened from the 80s. But what was interesting about this period was the ideas of development that accompanied this shift in the development agenda from the early post-independence period. So one was this idea that the state was the patrimonial state, too much corruption, not rational, not interested in establishing proper institutions to govern, instead interested in family rule and so on. The other one was an idea that labor, working people were kind of labor aristocracy that were raising the costs of production and pricing themselves out of foreign direct investment. And the third was comparative advantage, growth, trickle down, very much some of the modernization ideas, market instruments and laissez-faire, and so on. What it led to was basically a prioritization of economic policies and a delinking of economic and social policies. What was interesting in that period was that the wage policies had been established from the 70s, and so they had become kind of entrenched, so they were continued. People were still interested in income generation projects for women and credit and so on. And through that period, the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and so on, WID policies went through a process of development from WID to GAD, finally to gender mainstreaming. And this was very much also linked with the UN agenda for gender issues. Development was dropped as an agenda in this period, and economic growth was equated with development. If you look at the kind of massive critique of the structural adjustment programs that were undertaken, especially by African scholars, Codestria, under the leadership of Tandika Kandauri, led one such effort, and they produced a book called Our Continental Future. It's a document that I like to recommend because it historicizes Africa's development agendas and shows us the trajectories that Africa has gone through. And it's important to understand these trajectories in this period when people think of Africa as a historyless place. It's almost like economic liberalization and adjustment have become so entrenched that people don't even know that there was something else in the beginning, and something else can be part of Africa's future. So that's why this history is important. What's also important was that the part of the critique was about the state, what had happened to the state, because when the state was declared too corrupt and patrimonial, and laissez-faire became the approach to development or to economic progress, the state was relegated to a regulatory function. Basically, it was to make sure that things that were supposed to happen through the markets happened. So that critique also raised the question about the fact that Africa had developmental states in the early independence period, and that it was important to learn some of the lessons from those. Since the 2000s and in the last, I would say in the last 20 years, what some people call post-SARS, but certainly not a post-economic liberalization phase. There's been a whole rethinking about economic liberalization and what it has not been delivered, what it didn't deliver. And suddenly institutions such as the World Bank and so on are now interested again in the question of structural transformation, industrialization, and so on. And it has brought back the questions about developmental states, what kind of role states can play in a post-SAPS agenda. But in this period, the developmental state has become quite narrow in its agendas and quite economistic. So the countries that are being touted as having had developmental states, at least for certain periods, so Ethiopia under Meles Zenawi was seen as a good example of a developmental state. Rwanda under Kagame is seen as an example of a developmental state. You can see that the notion of development has become very narrow in the way in which these countries are being thought about. And fast forward to the current crisis. Right now, Africa is in turmoil again, and it's not just Africa, the whole world, but we seem to have got a very terrible part of it. Africa is in debt. Countries are defaulting on large debts, both foreign and domestic debt. Economies are contracting, and austerity is on the horizon again because several countries have run back to the IMF and are looking for hope. At the same time, the conversations about structural transformation and industrialization are still going on. But it's a very risky period we find ourselves in because one, the developmentalist agenda is likely to take backseat in this period of the cleanup, and people are talking about disciplining corrupt states. My own country, Ghana, is a good example of a place where citizens are completely fed up with the government's corruption. And some people even sound like the IMF will actually clean up the country. And I think in this period, we are likely to see a rollback of thinking about development and the developmental agendas. And it also has implications for social policy, for gender inequalities, and all of these things that we are concerned about. Ideas about gender and development have flourished in a parallel stream from the male-dominated discourse on development that I was talking about. However, that discourse has influenced many of the ideas about gender and development. And here, you can see some of the traditional divisions among feminists influencing how people have taken to the mainstream development agendas. So liberal feminists have tended to be quite modernist, supportive of the modernization agenda in their views of gender and development, because they have considered gender to be the main contradiction in society. Although I must say that one of the champions of liberal ideas, Esther Bossero, did discuss the differences between rural women's experiences in Asia and Africa, and basically pioneered a tradition of research that was very focused on the plight of rural women. Some radical feminists have been very interested in the interaction between patriarchy and the larger global political economy. So questions of accumulation on a world scale in which patriarchy was engaged in the exploitation of women's bodies and their labor, particularly their reproductive labor, is something that you see in the literature, represented especially by the work of Mariam Mies and the Baleful School of feminists. Her concept of housewifeization, in which she showed very clearly the ways in which the colonial enterprise basically structured the ways in which it would exploit it would exploit the colonies, also through the ways in which it treated women. there are echoes between this work and the work of the dependency school. It's very clear, and it's an interesting interaction of ideas, which has influenced a lot of current thinking about patriarchy and its relationship with the global political economy. In this period, there were also socialist and Marxist feminists in the West who wrote about the intersections of class and gender with capitalism. So the Subordination of Women's Group, which produced this an influential edited book known as Of Marriage and the Market, edited by Kate Young and others. Very important book in setting forth certain ideas which have become very popular among feminist political economy theorists at the moment. Another influential contribution to this thinking was Naila Kabir's Reversed Realities, Gender Hierarchies in Development Thoughts, in which she raised the issue of, she looked at the history of how the development industry came to discover women, and basically offered a critique of the emergence of women as a specific category in development thought, and also critique poverty, the poverty line as a measuring tool, looked at population control and a whole range of issues that the development industry had been peddling. Here in Africa, I think it's important to record two very signal events that contributed to ideas on gender and development. The Association for African Women in Development, in Research and Development, was established in the 1970s with the support of Codesria. And this organization explicitly was interested in development as it affected women, but also in development as more a process of empowerment than as a modernizing agenda. And you can see it in a declaration that they issued in Dakar in 1982. It came out of a workshop that they had on development called Another Development with Women. Again, this is a document worth looking at because it raises questions that clearly settle this group of women alongside more radical conceptions of underdevelopment and development, basically within the dependency approaches. And also it was interested in radical agendas like the Lagos Plan for Action and so on, but raised the ways in which those issues might contribute to the empowerment of women and the transformation of gender relations. The second one is an edited book edited by Aisha Imam, Amina Mama, and Fatou Sow. The book came out in 1997, but it came out of a workshop that was held in 1991 called Engendering African Social Sciences. And this book basically was a conversation with African social sciences, but it also, apart from critiquing the gender biases in the practice of social sciences, it offered ways in which gender issues could be analyzed that would surface gender inequalities, but also improve the social sciences and also the practice of development. If we look at this, these literatures I've just been referring to, the development literatures, and there's a vast collection of gender and development literature. I cannot hope to go through them, but there are a few things I want to raise about some of the preoccupations in the literature and their contributions to our understanding of gender inequalities. one obvious thing is the ways in which they combine micro level analysis with macro level issues of development. So you can see it, for example, in Bossorub's work, and you can see it in the work of other feminist scholars of agrarian change. They had a long-standing interest in improving the conditions of rural women's work. They also raised questions about development policy, programmatic responses to gender inequalities. And they also re-centered gender issues. What was interesting was that they argued often that agricultural development was failing in Africa because it had decentered gender issues, and that it was important to re-center these gender issues in thinking about agricultural development. Another thing they did very well was to explain what they called unexpected responses, or the lack of positive results from development interventions. So in the period when there were a lot of development projects and interventions directed at women, the women's only projects, the irrigation, the income generation things, there was an interesting strand of literature that was looking at these projects and trying to explain why they were not doing well, because the development industry was scratching its head that we've thrown everything at these women, it's not working. So they often surface things like the fact that many of these projects ignored or circumvented power relations within households and the conjugal union. So sometimes they would have a women's project, they had forgotten that intra-household relations were going to play a role in how women could participate. Sometimes they ignored women's heavy reproductive workloads. Sometimes they were silent about the overarching effects of the larger political economy. So there's an economic crisis, and people think that if women grow more rice, it will solve their problems, forgetting that there's a larger crisis of the political economy. Sometimes they simply didn't recognize women's resistance or agency. So instead, they were focusing on technical, economic, and institutional issues. So there are famous articles about the Muya Rice Project, an irrigation project in the Gambia, Kipsigi women in tea contract farming. All of these things point to the fact that women were actually resisting the free labor they were being made to offer to development projects that were being controlled by men, from which they were not really benefiting. Some of the literature also surfaced women's contribution to production, especially the time use studies and the studies that critiqued them and corrected them. These studies, you can see, come clearly from the lineage of Esther Bossorub, because her thing had been to show how much women were contributing to production. There was also a group of historical anthropological studies that pointed to more equitable agrarian systems of the past, the pre-colonial and early colonial periods. Some were describing gender inequalities in the control of land, resources, and so on. There was a substream, women and law studies, that were very interested in cultural practices, land tenure systems, and so on. Other studies identified policy biases that failed to recognize and support women's contribution to production. So they, for example, pointed to the cash crop bias, the extension bias, the fact that most extension workers were men. There were studies that were interested in the patriarchal character of the state. A lot of them were historical studies. If you look at this literature, there are clear disciplinary preoccupations, but also you began to see interdisciplinary approaches to gender and development. Especially in the 90s, in the period of adjustment, you saw a particular set of studies that were concerned about productivity, tenure security, and poverty. So IFPRI and organizations like that were very interested in women, but interested in them as productive persons. Then there were the studies that were looking at the changing gender relations in agrarian systems and land tenure as a result of commercialization and economic liberalization. I myself have contributed to this kind of literature. Gender-biased land tenure reforms, policy discourses on land and agrarian systems, and so on and so forth. You can see that much of the literature I'm referring to is literature that focuses on agrarian studies. So there is other literature, but I choose this because of our focus on work. All of these contributions to the literature are important. I also want to draw attention to two streams in the agrarian studies literature that we ought to pay attention to. One of them is the feminist political economy of agrarian studies. It's heavily influenced by the Marxist tradition in political economy, but basically it's a corrective of that tradition on the point of its gender blindness. It shows a number of interesting things. So, for example, it situates gender inequalities and gendered experiences within the broader capitalist transformations, globalization, economic liberalization, and agrarian change. It also shows how the intersection of inequalities has facilitated the extraction of surplus. And it also sees accumulation as hinging on social relations of exploitation between groups. There's a particular work and approach, the chain of exploitation approach framework, which I think is very useful because it shows that rural women are the last in a chain that includes a whole range of people: male smallholders, farm laborers, farm dwellers, all the way to transnational corporations. And shows the fact that there's a people build up, exploited people pass on their woes to somebody down the chain. And what this does, this chain of exploitation, is that it complicates an easy identification of exploiters and exploited. And it also shows us that women are not a homogeneous category. And it explains some of the things that we get confused about sometimes, which is like an example being the fractured character of solidarity, contradictions and conflicts between and within exploited groups, and so on. And what's interesting about feminist political economy is that it borrows insights from human rights, even from liberal feminist approaches, to address broader political economic questions of institutions, political power, and so on, and also intra-household relations of production and reproduction. And it has a sister approach, which is the feminist political ecology approach. What's different between them, and this is something that I really want to ask my colleagues who've seen these two approaches about, is that it seems to be that feminist political ecology approaches tend to be post-structuralist. One, they focus on the dynamic relations between gender, environment, and other aspects of social and cultural life. The important point being that they introduce the questions of the environment into the analysis in ways in which often feminist political economy approaches do not. And they are often post-structuralist, so they talk about gender as a process, performance, dynamic, and so on. And whilst they are very useful for demonstrating for bringing in the questions of the environment, and particularly when we are thinking about climate change and so on, this could be a very interesting approach. Sometimes I'm not too sure about the approach to gender relations as in terms of being a performance and also being processual and so on, because I wonder how the structural aspects of gender relations can be accounted for. I mentioned these two approaches, the feminist political economy and ecology, because I want to draw attention to the fact that they have actually been built on a long tradition of work that has been done on women in development by a whole range of people. And those were the studies I was referring to as the early literature and the more recent literature. But I think some of I want to mention 7 insights very quickly, and we'll come to the end of this presentation soon. What for me has been useful about feminist political economy is that it brings to us an expanded conception of capitalism in linking it with patriarchy, whether in thinking about capitalist patriarchy or in thinking about patriarchal capitalism. We get a particular dimension of capitalism that much of the analysis of capitalism doesn't pay attention to. Also, it has brought us an expanded conception of the economy. When we think about the economy, most people think at best of the formal and informal economy, but this allows us to see the subsistence economy and the domestic and care economy. And this is very important when we are thinking about social reproduction. It also helps us to see the gender blindness of the analysis of class. So there are many terms in the Marxist-inspired literature, such as peasants, semi-proletariat, and proletariat. And many times when people use these terms, they do not ask themselves what it means when the peasant is a woman or when the semi-proletariat is a woman. And yet, gender basically restructures the relationships between people and production systems in ways that change the meaning of peasant or semi-proletariat, depending on whether you're a man or a woman. Again, these insights help us to examine the dominant conceptions of the household, and they make intra-household relations quite visible. They also help us to account for the economic and patriarchal dimensions of institutions that most of us consider as cultural, so kinship, marriage, and so on. And this has led to many conceptual advances that you can see in the literature: the bargaining model of the household, the importance of intra-household relations, the question of access to and control of resources, gender ideologies, and so on, and so forth. So those ideas, like the ideas of development, also have a politics and a practice. And I'll say that the politics is a very broad church. The people practicing gender and development, whether as academics, as scholars, as activists, even as experts, are basically very broad in their, come from a very broad orientation. They are the gender experts who do not want to be called feminists, and they are those who want to be called feminists, like the African Feminist Forum or the journal Feminist Africa. In terms of practice, the practice of gender and development is very clear that it's dominated by liberal feminist agendas. And this is linked with the heavy influence of the USAID and UN gender experts in fashioning these practices and in implementing them. Independent gender experts support these activities. Feminist non-state actors most often are not in positions to influence these practices. We already know about the movement from Witward, Gard, and gender mainstreaming. I think the biggest critique of these development approaches is the question about depoliticization. It has also led to debates about how to justify these interventions, whether to focus on use instrumentalist arguments or to use rights arguments. And linked with that instrumentalist arguments is the question about the role of men. And maybe let me explain myself a little here. Basically, instrumentalist arguments are those arguments that justify interventions that promote women's rights or promote gender equality on grounds that it's good for society. So we attend to gender issues because it is good for child survival. If you educate women, their children will live longer. If women have a job, malnutrition will be dealt with, food security will be better for the household, and so on. Versus those ideas that say that we do this because women are citizens and they deserve equal rights like anybody else. And there's a whole debate going on about whether instrumentalist arguments are the way to go, because we live a reality of practice where we are working with patriarchal institutions, or whether it's a problem, because if you use instrumentalist arguments, they are not always true. They are not always borne out by facts. And would that then delegitimize the fight for gender inequalities? There are people who believe that men should have a central role in determining what to do about gender inequalities, because you can't get past them, so you might as well center them. These are some of the big debates that take place in the field of practice. And although feminist political economy insights have broadly influenced these debates, its strength has been mostly at the level of research and activism, and less in the field of practice. And that's something to pay attention to in thinking about how to intervene in the current conjuncture that we have. If we look at the current state of gender and development policy, I'll say that there are a number of things happening. I sense a gender fatigue and a crisis in gender mainstreaming. It's like it's hit the buffers. There's a limit to, we now know the limits of gender mainstreaming, but people don't know what to do about it. I think feminists are not sufficiently connected with larger conversations about development. And this has to do with being forced to work in silos and sectors. The UN has been particularly bad influence in this regard. The SDGs and so on, although they are said to be interconnected, you find that many people work on them in silos, and their interconnections and trade-offs and so on are not something that receives a lot of attention. Another big issue has to do with the problematic notions of family that underpin both economic and social policies, and the fact that feminists have not been able to challenge and dislodge some of these ideas. Also, social reproduction is quite muted in the analysis that is taking place currently on gender and development issues. The COVID pandemic provided a window, in the sense that it drew attention to the importance of home, the importance of social reproduction, and so on. And for a while, it seemed that it might be possible to put this at the center of the development agenda. But my own sense is that in the light of this current crisis, this window seems to have closed, and we have to think about how to find ways to open it and make sure that discussions pay attention to what we discovered about our societies during the COVID crisis. So I'll stop here.